Hi, good evening, everyone. Lovely to see you all here, as well as having our Zoom talk. So welcome to SARS March's meeting. So tonight, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Josh and his, group from his Institute of Technology, whether he's the Australian School of Astrology, I think was, yeah, exactly. He's a practicing astrologer, specialising in horary astrology, and is the founder and principal of the Australian School of Astrology. He is committed in delivering comprehensive astrological training in the Southern Hemisphere, with a focus on traditional techniques and practical application. Josh brings the depths of understanding to historical and contemporary astrology. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Josh. Welcome aboard. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. I tend to talk a lot, so I realized today that I had quite a lot of information to deliver as part of the talk. So because of that, Ben's on the tech behind the scenes. So if anyone has any questions as we go through the material, just feel free to pop it in the chat box. And if it's pressing or anything, Ben, just sort of interject. Like I sort of would prefer that. Yeah. It'll save me having to try and go back to slides if we want to look at charts and things like that. Sure. But that being said, obviously everyone is aware of the subject matter. So this is something that I've been curious about for quite a while. I read Joan Quigley's book probably about, oh God, must be coming up to like maybe 8 years ago or so. And I was really curious about the stuff that I found in there. And then I couldn't really talk about it to anyone because no one knew who Joan Quigley was. So I've sort of had it bubbling away in the back of my mind for a long time. And I guess because of not just because of what's going on in a topical contemporary sense in the US at the moment, but also because it's, one of those things I've had flagged in my mind. I thought it might be a good time to revisit it. So let's just dive in. As I say, I do kind of like the sound of my own voice. So if I sort of go off script, we'll try and come back to the session structure. So what are we going to do tonight? We're going to dive in and we're going to find out a little bit about Joan herself and where she came from, what she's all about. And we'll talk about some of the work that she's known for, or the legacy that she's left behind, to which she's most commonly referred. We'll talk a little bit about the context of her work. So we'll talk about the period of time that she was practicing in, a little bit about what's going on. So part of what tonight's talk will be, in order for us to explore Joan's material, we have to talk a little bit about the historical context, what was going on, and how she was practicing. So it'll be a little bit of not so much a history lesson, but we'll certainly be pivoting from a historical place in order to launch into the material. And the key piece, this is really why I wanted to do the talk, obviously to explore her work and to identify her techniques, which I'll come back to in a second, and then perhaps just talk about the way that she was utilizing them and what they mean. What we can sort of to take away from the record that she's left. And the reason why I say that is because in her text, she points to practices that she's engaged in, but she doesn't necessarily teach astrology by passing on her anecdotes and her recounts of this period. So in terms of taking away insight in terms of her practices and her actual techniques, it's sort of a process of teasing out the exact approaches that she used. So we'll talk about that with more specificity as we go through. And obviously, the key piece of this is to take away some interesting things that we can discuss and talk about some of the implications of her legacy and what she's left in terms of contemporary practice. So this is Joan. This is quite a flattering photo. Yeah, quite a beautiful lady. She's an American astrologer, and she was born and raised in San Francisco. So as far as I understand it, she lived the duration of her life in that area of California. She was a very patriotic Republican, which is the little elephant logo there. So her family were, by all accounts, Joan's family was well-to-do. So she came of age in not necessarily in a wealthy family where money was, no object, but she was certainly at the higher end. She commonly refers to her education at Vassar College, which isn't one of the Ivy Leagues. I thought that it was, but it turns out Vassar is sort of the penultimate, I think, before you get up towards the Ivy League range in America. So it's known as a liberal arts college, Vassar College, and she was quite proud of the fact that she went there. And her education is something that she used to introduce herself by, to sort of roll out some of her credentials. And obviously, we're here talking about astrology. So her astrology work, she released a number of books. I don't have the date on those, but she released quite a few. One of them is Astrology for Parents of Children and Teenagers, and one of the more popular publications was Astrology for Adults, both of which I think are out of print, but if anyone is so inclined, you'd be able to find them on eBay for probably a pretty penny, as I sure did. And obviously, this is what Joan is known for. This is why she's on the map in astrological practice. So Joan was connected to Ronald Reagan, and as it came out at the time, it was this sort of big scandal. I believe this was around the early 90s that this scandal broke, the late 80s, early 90s. And it came out that there was astrology in the White House, and Joan was linked as being the astrologer. And as far as I understand it, there were a lot of people putting their hands up when this broke to lay claim to the fact that they'd done work for Reagan while he was in the White House. Obviously, there were a few people looking for the sort of prestige, I think, that would go along with doing that sort of astrological work. So Joan put her hand up and said, no, like it was actually me. I was the one who was doing that work for Reagan. So it caused quite a splash, both nationally and internationally. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. So how did it work? Like, when we say that Joan was the White House astrologer, like, in what context did that occur? I've sort of heard, what would you call it? Sort of, maybe urban myths of court astrologers in a contemporary sense, where they're squirreled away in some back room of Buckingham Palace, perhaps, and trotted out, like, when there's no one about to sort of issue predictions. Like, no, it's not a good day for polo, William. Like, but like, we don't know, because that sort of stuff isn't spoken about. So if they do have court astrologers, no one's aware. So the actual practicalities of what was going on in terms of Joan being the White House astrologer, I found kind of fascinating to read about. So the way that it would work, at a high level, obviously there's some intricacy with it, but at a high level, Reagan as a president wasn't really in the business of sort of turning everyone away, shutting the White House doors, and inviting Joan out and putting charts up on the wall. The way that it worked is that Reagan would, when he needed some insight, or if he felt like he wanted some insight, he would get on the phone to his lovely wife, Nancy. And Nancy would funnel a lot of that sort of the questions that were pertinent, rather, through to Joan. So there's already a certain degree of, not necessarily Chinese whispers, but there's already a degree of distance between Reagan himself and the astrological practice and advice. So Nancy's on the phone, Joan gets on the phone, and the title of Joan's book, as we'll come to in a second, is What Did Joan Say?, which apparently was one of Reagan's monikers. What does Joan say about this or that? Now, obviously, this is, if you're going to lengths to mitigate your exposure to the actual practice of astrology, it stands to reason that Reagan and very likely Nancy probably were aware of the fact that this was quite sensitive material, that if people were to find out that they were consulting Joan in this way, that it's something that would have caused probably a lot of public upset, like, just even in the way that they were getting this advice from Joan. And of course that it did, because this is Don Regan, who's not actually a relative of Reagan. So a little confusing, but Don Regan was the chief of staff for Ronald Reagan for a period of time, not for his entire presidency, but he came in sort of midway through. So this was already well underway before Don came on the scene. So as the president's right-hand man, Don's trying to orchestrate meetings with high levels of government. He's trying to make sure that things get funneled through the system as quickly as possible, and kept hitting brick walls, and he had no idea why. So he's kind of picking up the phone, wondering what the holdup is, and getting the runaround when he comes in because he's got no idea why things are taking so long to get approval, particularly with the scheduling office, as we'll come to. So Don, which we'll come back to him a little bit later in the piece, but Don found this whole concept when it came to light for him quite a shocking scenario, and obviously he was under no illusions about the sort of sensitivity that this material incurred. However, Don didn't last in the White House very long. He was there for a couple of years. His actual title was the 11th White House Chief of Staff. So when he was shown the door for reasons that are unrelated to astrology, but his chagrin was very well known to Reagan. He knew that he and Reagan didn't necessarily butt heads over it, but his consternation was something that certainly got fed back. So when he was shown the door, that didn't go well for him. So after his years of struggle in the White House, Don actually releases a tell-all. And his memoir comes out, and in the memoir, one of the quotes is that he says, virtually every major move and decision the Reagans made during my time as White House Chief of Staff was cleared in advance with a woman in San Francisco who drew up horoscopes to make certain that the planets were in a favorable alignment for the enterprise. Now, when Nancy got wind of this, Nancy could not believe her ears. Like, she was absolutely shocked, absolutely appalled at the fact that somebody so close to them, the first family, would air their secrets like this, air their dirty laundry in public. And obviously, as we say, it's sensitive material. She took steps and great pains to at least keep what they were doing not necessarily secret, but certainly discreet. Where it came to paying Joan, she would deposit money into the account of a friend, and that friend would then write checks that she would post to Joan. So just another one of these sort of degrees of separation between the actual first family and the obtaining of this sort of advice. So Nancy, in turn, wrote her memoir set, and she comes out with a bit of a spin on what it was that was occurring at this time, because Nancy really copped the brunt of it when all of this came out. And she said, astrology was simply one of the ways that I coped with the fear I felt after my husband almost died. And we'll talk about this a little bit more as we get through it. But early in Reagan's presidency, there was an assassination attempt. And Nancy says, look, astrology was something that I was really using to cope on a personal level, where it came with that particular shock. She said, Joan was a good listener, and she responded with the warmth and compassion that I needed. Before long, I found myself telling her about other problems I was having. On all these matters, Joan was helpful and comforting. I came to view her as a friend. She was also a kind of therapist. So Nancy, at this point, I believe part of the reason why she wrote this memoir, which very aptly is titled My Turn, was so that she could have her say. And, especially when you're in that position, I mean, it's your husband who's numero uno, right? I mean, he's the one who's going to command the crowds and the attention. And it's not so much that Nancy couldn't, but the ability for her to be able to make public statements and clear the record, or even change the narrative, perhaps, was something that was very likely not necessarily completely in her control. So this book, this book of hers, this set of memoirs, gave her the option to be able to springboard into shaping the narrative around the Reagan's use of astrology, because prior to that, everything that came out when Don released his book was something that was completely outside of their control. So the media, in their way, they blew it into something huge, that some of it was true, a lot of it was true, but a lot of it was conflated. So Nancy takes this opportunity to come out and to say, look, here's the reason why I did it. And already in this sort of language, she's, in a way, you could view this as though she's backpedaling from the astrological material. Oh, she was more of a friend. She was, more of a therapist. It was more of a counseling thing. Well, Joan, when Joan saw that, Joan could not believe her eyes in Nancy's book. And she came out with her tell-all. So it's a bit of a tawdry story where everyone wants to have their say and everyone's putting books out through the media back when books were still quite the big thing. And obviously it goes beyond a magazine spread. You know, this is something where there's so much to get through because Joan was working alongside the Reagans for the entire duration of Ronald's presidency. So we're talking about 8 years plus. So in order to be able to comment on the record in your own voice, Joan in turn released her book. What does Joan say? My 7 years as White House astrologer to Nancy and Ronald Reagan. And she said, it reads like fiction of Nancy's account, and much of it is evasive. What she has left out about the way she used astrology and my ideas would fill a book, which was quite literal because this was the opening page. So it sort of sets you up to realize that you're in for quite a salacious story. So when did the Reagans start using astrology? Like, what was the story there? You know, where did this come about? So Reagan, obviously, I believe most people are aware of the fact that he was quite a famous Hollywood actor. He's an Aquarian sun sign, so he's very civic-minded, and he ran for governor. And when he ran for governor of California, at the time, there's speculation. I don't know if there's necessarily a lot of evidence to support this, but there's speculation that quite a famous astrologer at the time, a man named Carol Reiter, was working alongside him to give him some input into how to navigate the landscape at that time. Some sort of tips and tricks to how to sort of just boost himself a little bit in terms of winning the governorship. And this is the chart for the swearing in for when Reagan became the governor. Now, if we look closely at this chart, obviously we see the time is 12:01 a.m. on the 3rd of January of 1967. So that's a bit of an unusual time. I don't know if everyone is sort of standing around the water cooler waiting to sort of dive into champagne and afternoon tea. This is quite an odd time, middle of the night, like quite literally. So anyone who was in the know at that time recognized the fact that there was a reason behind that time. The publicized reason, I believe, at the time was because they wanted to prevent the former governor pushing through any legislation at the last minute. But as we'll come to see, this chart there are fingerprints of astrological work all over this chart. So we'll just keep this in mind at the moment. And this isn't Joan's work, but it certainly feeds into some of her work. And it's important to highlight because this is really one of the first times that you can point to a chart and a time and say the Reagans were using astrology at that point. It is worthwhile to note as well, just to give some context to the overall saga, that Nancy and Ronald came from the Hollywood milieu. So they both knew a lot of people in entertainment. They knew probably quite flamboyant figures. And the way that Nancy characterized it at one point was that everyone was into that sort of thing, that everyone in Hollywood was fairly, what's the word I'm searching for? That they were, I can't think of the word, you know, when you're bohemian and a little bit, you know, when they say break a leg, you know, like the word escapes me, but I'm sure it's quite superstitious. That's it. It was at the back of my tongue, but it wasn't coming out. So the Hollywood milieu were all kind of superstitious, even in a saying like that, you know, break a leg. So they said that it was quite common for people to look for signatures that would give them a bit of a boost. But we can say, based on understanding how long the Reagans were using astrology for, that as far back as 67 is an example. And he didn't go into the presidency until the 80s. So quite some time they were affiliated with astrological signatures. But Joan wasn't on the scene at that point. And Joan came to the Reagans via the Merv Griffin show. I've never seen the Merv Griffin show myself, but I get the sense that it's a talk show. And it's a bit before my time. But Merv was somebody who was sympathetic to astrology as a talk show. Those sort of variety shows have a lot of different figures coming through the door. This is actually where Jerry Seinfeld got a bit of a boost early on in his career, was on the Merv Griffin show. So you've got these different cast of characters coming in and out. And one of the things that they tried was putting an astrologer on. And Joan was one of the astrologers that they brought on to the Merv Griffin show. And she would make predictions. And by Joan's account, she would come in and make predictions. And then the next time that she was invited on the show, they'd bring her back out to talk about all the predictions that she made in the previous session. And they would talk about all the ones that she got right. Which, to even be operating at that level, you would expect her to already be quite sophisticated and quite confident in the things that she was putting out. So it was via the Merv Griffin show, where Merv actually had a connection to Nancy Reagan, I believe, through the Hollywood circles. And because of their use of astrology, he actually put the two of them in touch. And Joan, on one of her trips out to the Merv Griffin show, this is sort of a bit of a window into the way that Joan practiced. She went onto the show and she said, the first person who greeted me backstage asked what I had seen in the Griffin's horoscope. So she was going on and she was asked to talk about Merv's chart. And she said, I told him that Merv had recently put money in his son Tony's name. And she says that that was true, that prediction worked out to be accurate, which, even if we pause there for a minute, I was thinking to myself, what sort of signature would I be looking for in a chart to see that? You know, potentially some exchange between the second and the eighth house. But it gives us a hint into the fact that she was using astrology in a more traditional sense, given that she was looking at objective correlations with the chart. I'm not sure that I would put my name to a prediction like that, but she saw this in the chart, said it had transpired, and they were all blown away. They said, yes, that's absolutely true, by Joan's account. And this producer, after the show, went to Joan, and she says, the same man came to my dressing room to ask if I would do his horoscope as well as his family's, and I said that I couldn't. Merv was well aware from the beginning that I never did astrology for anyone unless I wanted to specifically, which is interesting because most astrologers are quite happy to roll out the welcome mat, but Joan's turning them away, saying, no, I'm only going to do astrology for those people that I choose to do it for. So she met the Reagans via Merv Griffin, but didn't actually begin doing any real work with them. So if we cue a little bit further ahead in time, in 76, Reagan took a stab at running for the presidency, and he put himself forward in what they refer to as a primary race to win the Republican vote. And he was up against, I forget the name of the gentleman he was up against, but the key piece of this is that this was his first serious run. And at that time, again, Joan wasn't on the scene necessarily. They'd been working alongside a student of Carol Writer's, someone here named Jean Dixon. And she was quite well known as an astrologer, but also as a seer, as a clairvoyant. So she was quite well known for her predictions. We could do a whole other segment on Jean. She's sort of fascinating in her own right. But she was at that time, I think, the one that the Reagans were consulting with the most in terms of giving them some insight at this point in Reagan's career. And unfortunately, at that period, 76, he didn't win. Reagan didn't quite make it that time around, and he conceded defeat. And of that period, just sort of backtracking a little bit. So Joan had been introduced to Nancy, and they had a certain affiliation, but she wasn't on the books, shall we say. She sort of, they knew of each other. And there's some suggestion that Nancy had reached out to Joan during this period, very likely in a human way when things weren't going well. You know, Jean said this, what do you think? You know, that's pretty common. But of that period, so the key piece here, Reagan was defeated. Of that period, Joan says, I never for 1 minute believed that Reagan would win. He had the kind of adverse configuration of Saturn to his horoscope that always causes political leaders to suffer defeat. I'm not sure what I actually did for the campaign that year, but it wasn't much, or I would remember, which is interesting. You know, you get brought on for somebody in the presidential race. It seems a little bit curious that you would forget what you might have done. But, you know, I don't know, it wasn't me, you know, I wasn't around. Whatever I did, I can't remember. Interesting though that he did lose at that time. So you could almost read what she's saying there as a way of distancing herself from it. It wasn't again until 1980 that Reagan made another serious stab at the presidency, and this was a lot more successful. Joan was brought on early in the piece in order to be able to weigh in and probably to shape things in a way that she hadn't been able to before. And she says, I studied the horoscopes of all the leading candidates and came to the conclusion that Reagan had by far the best chance of winning. I called Nancy and asked if she would be interested in my analysis of Ronnie's horoscope, Ronnie's horoscope, and a detailed account of what I saw astrologically for him. So Jones actually reached out to Nancy and said, look, if you need some help with this, then I'm quite happy to weigh in and let you know what I see. In my report, I had underlined in red ink my typewritten warning not to make any foreign policy pronouncements on August 19th. Now, on this date, back in 1980, Reagan had actually made a pronouncement of an international flavor. And he'd come out and said, oh, if I'm president, then we plan on recognizing Taiwan and not the Republic of China. Which was quite the political gaffe, and everyone was sort of gasping in the aisles because that was something that didn't bode well for relations with China. So Jones says, I'd underlined it, I'd put it in red ink in my typewritten report. From then on, the campaign directors were glued to my report. Nancy called practically daily. She relayed my advice to the others, including the president-to-be. So as things started to heat up and it was getting towards the pointy end of that race, Reagan entered into a debate with the then sitting president, President Carter. And this is an interesting thing to keep note of in light of Jones' contribution to the Reagans and particularly this campaign. She actually elected the chart for the time of this debate. And if anyone here follows or practices electional astrology, if we take even just a brief look around the chart, generally speaking, the consensus with electional astrology is that the first house would go to the person who initiates the action. So in this case, we've got Reagan represented by the sign of Cancer, with the moon quite strong in its own domicile there, angular in the first house. So again, you can sort of see the fingerprints of an astrologer at work here. They're trying to fortify the person who's engaging in this action. What everyone else would make of this chart is something that is obviously for everyone to think about. I'm not sure if I like the rest of the chart. When I look at it, there's a lot of things below the horizon here. But that's if you were to look at it as just a standalone chart. Jones says, the time and place chosen to begin a debate determines what will happen during the course of the debate, as well as its outcome. Who will win and who will lose? To do this expertly, the astrologer must take the horoscopes of both debaters into consideration in relation to the starting time. In this, I concentrated on what I considered to be the best opportunity astrologically, that I reinforced the basic weakness in Carter's horoscope, and by my expert timing, ensure that he would trip himself up and lose. Now, a couple of key important things to take away there is that the actual chart for the election, the event itself, she's circling around the traditional concept that you need to be looking at nativities in conjunction with that event. How do both of these people become impacted by this event itself? So she's worlds away from, strictly speaking, sort of natal astrology, as we would define it today, which we would take a more modern view, the psycho-spiritual, if you will, approach. She's certainly looking beyond the subjective and looking at the objective, and she's bringing both people in to see how they're going to win. The interesting thing here, even though when we look at the fact that the first house is fortified here and that moon's quite strong, it's angular, it's in its own sign, that this isn't the approach that Joan was really actually aiming for. As she says, her approach was to try and fortify Reagan by accentuating his opponent's weaknesses. She says, my reasoning was unorthodox from an astrological point of view. The average astrologer would never have chosen that time, and she's probably right. This chart around the outside is, whose chart is that? Hang on. I believe it is Carter's. Hang on a sec. I have observed that, yeah, here we are. I have observed that while a grand trine can be lucky for material good, I have observed that while a grand trine can be lucky for material good fortune or agreeable characteristics, it can be too much of a good thing, and it tends to make the individual, the luck, the individual who is lucky, careless, or lax. I think I have a typo in there. So yes, this is Carter's chart around the outside, and just pointing out what she's referred to here. So the inner wheel, once again, is the elected chart, and this is how Carter is coming in and interacting with that. So what we see is a grand trine that's activated by the electional moon. So we have it here between Carter's moon with the placement of Uranus, as well as, where are we? I think Pluto's in the mix here as well. In his nativity, he's got Pluto in the mix, I think. But so what she was aiming to do here is effectively to accentuate this grand trine. So if we look just at Carter's chart for a moment, we've got down here, we've got Mercury at 21 degrees of Virgo. And up there, it's actually sitting in an opposition to Uranus. So by activating this grand trine in his chart, she was basically hoping to trigger that in a way that the Uranian element would be the thing that would potentially reveal itself through this. She said, I made up my mind to reinforce the moving moon with another catalyst, the rising sign. The rising sign moves even faster than the moon does, a degree approximately every 4 minutes. So that tracking it was the best way to tell what would happen from minute to minute during the course of the debate. Now, this is really fascinating to me because if you're looking at an endeavor that is going to take, a common one is to cast a chart for yourself when you're entering a new workplace. So there's no finite sense of time of what you're looking for in that chart. You're expecting those themes to be things that will live on for quite a long time. But if you're going to something like a debate in this case, and it's only a window of at max, what, 2 hours, a couple of hours a throw, how would you attempt to use that chart in a way that it would tell you what was going to happen? How would you time the event? So Joan chose to use the technique of timing the moving ascendant to give her an indication as to what was going to play out. So I would expect that she probably did it with the ascendant and the descendant, seeing which way each party was tracking throughout that time, which I find to be an interesting way of using that chart. So this is what she's aimed to do. She's tried to, as I say, accentuate Carter's weakness here. She says, I was banking on I was banking on his getting careless. He did what I anticipated. He became overconfident and careless and did not consider the impression he was making. I had decided on the time that laid a trap. So what ended up happening was that as they're having this debate and themes are going across back and forth, Carter decides to bring onto the table in this nationally televised event that he asked his daughter what she thought the most important point would be that they should talk about. And his daughter at that point was something like 11 years old. And apparently that was a huge political gaffe, and everyone sort of was chuckling in the aisles because, this man who was the head of the country had asked his 11-year-old daughter what they should prioritize. So as Joan said, I decided on that time, and he'd walked into my trap, basically. The moment he said it, it was all over for Carter. The naive, ingenious remark cost him the debate and led to a landslide election in Ronald Reagan's favor. So back at this time, that I found even that image quite startling to see when I saw it. I mean, it's virtually the entire country that he won. So when people say that they won by a landslide, you almost couldn't get any further ahead in this. So Reagan, obviously indicated by the red states there in the US, and quite a successful victory, quite a decisive victory, I think. Bearing in mind that Joan had played a small part in that process, and if anyone was receiving that advice and that's what you were able to pull off at the end, you'd be pretty impressed, I think. So this is just Reagan's actual horoscope, the working horoscope, I would refer to it as. This is the chart that Joan rectified. There's some interesting notes on Astro Databank about this. There's a time that they have listed, and there's also they list in their notes Joan's rectified time. Joan bases her rectified time based on family information, which, given how closely she worked with them, I'd have to assume that she was probably correct. And this was the chart that she used for Ronald Reagan. So the 20 degrees rising, 12 degrees on the MC. We see the Aquarian sun there. He's got a Taurian moon. We could go on and on about that. But she was using this chart in order to determine how he fed into that elected event. This is how he connects into the Sibley chart. So on the inside ring here, we have Reagan's rectified horoscope, the Sibley US chart, which is one of the most commonly used charts for the US. What you'll see is the Sun Moon conjunction, a little wide, 9 degrees in Aquarius. And of that, Joan said, Reagan's Aquarius Sun on the US moon indicates a sort of love affair compatibility between the president and the people, which is interesting, given that monumental landslide of a victory. You know, he was easily likable, I think. What's interesting to me in this chart to point to is the fact that Saturn in the Sibley chart makes its way up to Reagan's MC. And it's interesting thinking about charts like Queen Elizabeth II, who natally has Saturn on the MC. There's this idea of a certain responsibility that's brought into play. It's interesting that that's activated for Reagan through the Sibley chart. So by his involvement with the US, he's triggering his own sense of duty, I guess, in a way. It's interesting to see that into play. And here we are, a little bit after, not very long after this at all, the 30th of March in 1981, Reagan, who was probably enjoying his victory at that time, doing some public meet and greets. There was an assassination attempt that was actually quite serious. He was taken to hospital. By all accounts, he was not in a good way, and they managed to bring him back. But this was a real catalyst in terms of the part of the story that we care about, because Joan's done a bit of work for the Reagans up until now. She's sort of flitted in and out, and then this event occurs that was the turning point, especially for Nancy. Nancy says, I was devastated after the shooting. Ronnie recovered, but I was a warrior, and now I really had something to worry about, that it might happen again, and that this time I would lose him forever. Astrology was simply one of the ways I coped with the fear I felt after my husband almost died, coming from Nancy's memoirs. Astrology was something I did to hedge our bets, to try to keep Ronnie from getting shot again, and to keep me from going mad with worry. At least by consulting with Joan, I was doing something. If I hadn't taken every step I could think of to protect my husband, and Ronnie had been shot again, I would never have been able to forgive myself. Joan comes in, and this is an exchange that Joan recounts with Nancy. She says that Nancy asked, could you have told about the assassination? Joan says, yes, of course I could, had I been looking. However, I haven't been following your charts or tracking the mundane material for Washington. I'm sorry. Had I been looking, I would have warned you. Which is an interesting remark that people could have a different take on. Joan says, I had the knowledge, the expertise, the resourcefulness, and the willingness to take the infinite pains that were needed to guide Ronald Reagan safely from May of 1981 until June 1 of his last year in office, when his own horoscope indicated that his life would no longer be in danger. I knew that if I succeeded in protecting him, he would go out of the office one of the most popular presidents in United States history. So the context of this statement is that Nancy has said, will you do some work for us? Like, will you come on and help me to protect Ronald? So it sounds as though, based on this anecdotal evidence, that she said to Joan, this awful thing happened, could you have prevented it? And Joan says, of course I could. I'm an astrologer. I could do that for you, no trouble. So Nancy says, will you do it? And Joan is weighing up whether or not she would take this level of responsibility on. What's interesting here is that by Joan's account, she says that she was basically she was weighing up the huge amount of effort that this would be against obviously her own personal life, as well as the sort of duration of time that we're talking about. I mean, this is no small period that we're looking at. Like we're talking basically 7 to 8 years that she would be glued into these people. But what's interesting and something that we should all ponder and reflect on is that Joan says here that his horoscope indicated that his life would be in danger up until June 1 of his last year of office, which is interesting. She doesn't in her text go through and identify exactly what she's making reference to there, but she says, I can take on the responsibility. I think that I've got what it takes to protect this man. I knew that the Reagan's horoscopes would be uppermost in my mind during that 7-year period, almost to the exclusion of anything else, that I would be held to absolute standards of performance, that I had to be right. So once again, she's considering what this would involve if she took this on. And she said the temptation to say yes was very great, as I'm assuming it would be for some. Some would shy away from it, but Joan only does astrology for the people that she's interested in. So Reagan was obviously someone she was interested in. Patriotic Republican, well-to-do lady, well-connected. So as she says, the temptation to say yes was very great. The most important, however, I felt that doing astrology for a president would be a unique experience insofar as we know in American history. I would be able to contribute to, protect, and at times to influence this most powerful man. I would participate in a more intimate way than the publicly recognized insiders of greatest importance. It was bound to be an incomparable and fascinating experience. So she's pretty interested at this point. And getting into a little bit of what she actually did. So at this point, she said, all right, I'll take it on. I'll be the White House astrologer. So by all accounts, Joan's responsibility as the White House astrologer was that she was in charge of the timing of all press conferences. So anytime that there was something that needed to be put out, anytime that Reagan was going to get up in front of the cameras, in a very similar way as what he did during his debate, Joan was tasked in her mandate as the astrologer for the Reagans to come up with an auspicious time for all of the press conferences. She was also tasked with looking for safe periods for Air Force One to depart. Now, this is kind of an interesting one because Joan speaks, when we think of electional astrology, when most people think of electional astrology, when we talk about when you should cast a chart, what is the moment of the endeavor? Sometimes that's obvious. If you leave the house and you want to know how that trip's going to go, then you look at the time for the moment that you left the house. A common one that I've been talking about lately is a little bit of a slippery one. What constitutes the start of a business? Is it the moment that you register the business? Is it the moment that you publish some flyers? Is it the moment that you start trading? And that's sort of malleable depending on the context there. The reason why I bring that up is because Air Force One departures have sort of a multi-pronged approach for Joan. So most of the time, if the president's leaving the White House and he's going to take Air Force One somewhere else, it's for a reason. He's got something he's going to do. So the way that Joan was approaching her electional work for Air Force One departures wasn't just because she was looking for periods of safe travel for Reagan, but she was using that as the starting point for all of his ventures. So when the plane took off the ground, if he was heading for, say, Reykjavik, which we'll look at in a bit, then she would take the moment that Air Force One departed as being the elected chart for that endeavor. And basically that chart from the moment that he took off, every action after that was basically contained within that chart because it was all connected to the overall mission or the scope of the trip, which is interesting. Some people would be looking at the time for the moment that negotiations began, which wouldn't necessarily be wrong, but Joan chose to use the chart from the moment of departure. So Air Force One departures, as I say, had a multi-pronged level of consideration in them. Also, medical procedures, something that's a more traditional approach to astrology certainly looked at with a lot of care and regard. If anyone is around on Saturday, I'll be talking a lot about medical procedures at the FAA meeting. But here we see a photo of Reagan undertaking one of those medical procedures that Joan had actually elected. And then also she was tasked with electing dates for the State of the Union address. As well as just electing auspicious dates in general. Now, in general is something where if we drill down on it, what does that mean? Like what's an auspicious date on the regular? Well, back to Don Regan for a minute, who was not exactly discreet about his discussion of what occurred during this time. He said, although I never met this seer, Mrs. Reagan passed along her prognostications to me after conferring with her on the telephone. She had become such a factor in my work and the highest affairs of the nation that at one point I kept a color-coded calendar on my desk, numerals highlighted in green ink for good days, red for bad days, yellow for iffy days, And as an aid to remembering when it was propitious to move the President of the United States from one place to another, or schedule him to speak in public, or commence negotiations with a foreign power, which is quite an astonishing level of influence to have at that point. He goes on to say the frustration of dealing with a situation in which the schedule of the President of the United States was determined by occult prognostications was very great, far greater than any other I had known in nearly 45 years of working life. So this political professional is trying to push things across the line, and someone's saying, hang on. What does Joan say? Today's an iffy day. We're not going to be pushing forward. So I feel for him, but he definitely felt quite hamstrung. He said, I had thought that the president should go out and meet the world, and kept telling him so. The First Lady's friend in San Francisco had predicted on the basis of astrology that harm would come to Reagan if he went out of the White House, or even on certain days outdoors. All press conferences were also subject to the friend's approval. The president's public appearances had always been arranged with the First Lady's approval, and it was impossible to change this through appeals to logic. So pretty heavy-handed language that I think paints a fairly clear picture of not only Joan's influence, like, here's someone coming out and saying of his own volition, this definitely occurred, and here's the scope of what occurred. And it, for him, it was no laughing matter. She had quite a lot of pull. Anyone who only reads Joan's book is going to sort of question her remarks. Is she embellishing in certain ways? If anyone reads the text, it's highly likely that she has. It's hard not to feel that when you read that book. But here's Don Regan saying, oh no, like I had a color-coded diary on my desk where he probably, I imagine at times, saw red days and went, forget it, I'm going to the pub. So the interesting thing to think about here, though, is bad days are obviously self-evident. So if we start critically thinking as astrologers, what constitutes a bad day? I think we could all probably pretty much imagine what they are. There'd be some element of physical danger, of which Joan was hyper aware by her own account, basically. She saw it as her utmost important, the utmost important part of her mandate was to keep the president safe. And I think that Nancy made no secret of the fact that that was part of the reason why she wanted Joan's assistance. We would also expect that bad days would have some political consequence, potentially, a slippery slope, like the off remark, perhaps. And also we could probably put under that banner unsuccessful endeavors, just days that it doesn't look good to get out of bed, which we all know. But apparently the president can say, no, I'm not taking action today. The interesting thing for me, though, is what constitutes a good day. If we flip the narrative there, she's saying, okay, we've got red for bad, but what exactly constitutes good? And she doesn't actually clarify this in her source material. So we can only assume that it's possibly either the absence of bad aspects in a chart, or that the days in and of themselves, she's obviously electing charts and using them as the radix most of the time. So rather than looking at Reagan's personal horoscope and looking at his transits, seeing whether or not he's connecting to the energy of the day in a way that's probably in alignment with whatever task is at hand. So if it's, we have a bad moment with Saturn in the 9th, it's probably unlikely that he'll talk about anything to do of a foreign matter necessarily, But Joan doesn't actually go out of her way to say what constitutes good or bad. So it's interesting. We could sort of speculate what good is meant to imply. So queuing forward a little bit here, his first 4 years in the White House, he comes up to the mid. I'm not sure how they would phrase it. The middle of his tenure. He did his first 4 years and he's coming up for re-election. Now here's where things really start to get quite interesting, actually, because as we remember before, Joan didn't elect the chart for Reagan being sworn in as governor. But we'll revisit that in just a moment. So this is the chart for Ronald Reagan's re-election. So Ronald Reagan, as we saw a minute ago, his MC was very close to this degree. So Reagan's MC would be sitting around about this point, the ascendant of the re-elected campaign chart. So sorry, let me say that again. The election for the re-election campaign, which Joan had put together. Interestingly, she says it was rather an odd time, 10:55 p.m. Like every other chart for beginning a venture, it showed not only the events along the way, but the way the project would end. In this particular chart, the planets were grouped in the part of the chart that referred to the person making the declaration to run. So in this instance, we can see based on the cluster of planets in the third house that Joan was aiming to highlight this area of the chart thematically. So she's clustered the moon there, especially, which would be an important point to place. However, the moon, for anyone who would practice traditional techniques, is in detriment there in the third house. That looking at this chart alone, you would sort of question the strength of it. But once again, everything is looked at in the context of the horoscope. So here we have Reagan's chart, and these are the three charts that we can look at sort of alongside one another. So Reagan's nativity is here in the center. And what we have here is, as I was saying a minute ago, he's got some 12 degrees on the midheaven in Libra, and she's aimed for that to be pretty close in the elected, the elected chart for the re-election campaign. And then going back over here to, I think I've got slides for this actually. Yeah, so we're highlighting that the MC in Reagan's chart, as well as the ascendant in both of the charts that were elected for him to run for public office. So even though Joan didn't elect the first one, she obviously must have taken a look at that, and she either found that herself or the Reagans passed this on and said, look, this is what Carol Reiter thought. And Joan happened to think that that was quite a good idea, bringing the MC to the ascendant. And it's one of the things that's that certainly has contributed to pushing him across the line. Let's not forget that, you know, he's already got sort of a leg up, as it were, with his moon being on the sun of the Sibley chart. So there is already some love to be found there.
Actually, that's Sibley chart. The Venus is more closer to the moon.
It is, yeah.
6 degrees rather than
Yeah. It's close to both of those. Joan, what was Joan's comment? She said, "Oh, it's kind of like a love affair." So I dare say she was probably bringing that in as well, in her thinking that Venus being so close to both of those luminaries that it played a part. But interesting. Is there anything that anyone wants to sort of point out from these charts? Anything that I might pause so people can have a look at them?
Yeah, I think getting the MC to be rising, that's very interesting because MC has to do with public status. And were there other astrologers who were also being consulted, like Walker or Jean Dixon and all?
Early in the piece, earlier in the piece, around this period of the swearing-in ceremony, that's when Carol Reiter was around and Jean Dixon were weighing in with their take on everything. At this point for the re-election campaign, so far as I'm aware, sorry.
Why did the choice tip over?
Why did the choice tip? There's a reference in both Don Regan's biography as well as Joan's text as well, where apparently they don't name the individual, but they say that they do refer to it as a female, and they say that they believed that she had lost her powers. Which is an interesting way of phrasing it, because, you know, if you just read it and you weren't sort of aware of the backstory there, you would assume that whoever said that doesn't understand what astrologers do. But Jean Dixon, as far as I understand it, was operating in a clairvoyant capacity as well. So I'd say that she was probably mixing modalities a little bit where it came to the work she was doing for the Reagans. And there's nothing that I have found that says explicitly why they cut her loose. But they did sort of transition over to Joan more fully after the assassination attempt. And they chose to sort of put all their ducks in Joan's basket, so to speak.
She in no way hinted at any premonition about the event, because assassination is a big thing.
I think, do you mean Joan? Do you mean?
No.
Jean Dixon?
No. This astrologer.
Yeah. This one here for the swearing in. Wait, hang on. Do you mean Joan or Jean?
Yes.
They're also close in name. Joan, I think that Joan, there is a section in the text where in Joan's source text, where she says that she had a dire feeling about something. But I don't know if it was connected to that period of the assassination attempt. But when Nancy reached out to her, she sort of put her hand up and said, "Oh, you know, I could have helped you had I been looking at the charts, but I wasn't looking at the charts, so therefore I didn't know." Basically.
Yeah, I was wondering why the fate got 45.
Yeah. But yeah, it is interesting bringing the MC to the ascendant. It's quite an interesting technique to think about doing, especially on days where you may not want to be in the public spotlight. You may want to, you know, like avoid that sort of thing. I was actually just saying to Cheryl as we were getting set up tonight that just as a point of happenstance, that the ascendant for tonight's meeting was, what was it, Cheryl? 6 degrees of Virgo. And my midheaven's at 22 Virgo, but my Mercury's at 7 degrees of Virgo. So I thought, how interesting that, you know, we're talking like, with a moment of synchronicity. We're talking about MCs going to the ascendant, and here it is at play in what we're doing here tonight. But interesting charts, interesting to see the sort of the follow through with this, and we can see how Joan was approaching these charts by looking at very far beyond the scope of what a psycho-spiritual approach to astrology would be bringing in. Like at no point have we seen her talk about transits to Reagan's horoscope. At no point does she bring that up at all. She seems less interested in that so far, and she's looking at how Reagan is plugging into all of these things beyond himself, which is interesting. It's sort of something to flag, certainly in regards to what Joan prioritized as part of her technique with Reagan's charts. This one is charts for an operation that Reagan had to have. And the 10th of July was when he was supposed to actually be having this operation. So sorry, I'm getting a bit tongue-tied. The 13th of July was when he actually ended up having it. And Don Regan, in his autobiography, once again, these were one of those things that caused him to have a bit of a stone in his shoe. You know, he had heard that the president needed some form of operation, and then when he started doing some research around what it was that the issue concerned, which I believe was a polyp of some kind, but at a high level, this was an operation that he should have been having fairly quickly. So when he's in hospital for a couple of days, you know, someone like the president is not even had the operation yet. He's wondering what the hell's going on. And he's obviously tried to make inquiries, and there was a mounting sense of frustration between he and Nancy over this, because he was trying to push Nancy to find out where the real issue was here, you know, and like what was going down. So in these charts, there's not much of, yeah. And so the key substantive difference here is that the moon moves from the the fourth house up to the sixth, which again is something that I found interesting to take away from Joan's technique. The way that Joan characterized it when in her text, when she says, you know, here's why I did what I did, she says that she feared that if they had have performed the operation on the 10th, that they wouldn't have gotten everything, she believes, which is something for everyone to think about. Again, she doesn't go into detail about the techniques that she used here, but she felt strongly enough. And again, let's remember that her mandate in her mind was to protect the president at all costs. You know, Joan saw herself as sort of on par, if not more important than someone like the Secret Service, whose actual job it is to protect the president. She took it so seriously that even though she gives these two charts short shrift, I thought it was interesting enough to look at that we see the moon moving to the sixth house, which would normally be highlighting illness, is what one would assume. I'm not sure if in Joan's mind that she thought that highlighting illness was going to be a positive thing because she wanted them to be able to find all of it. Which is the way I would imagine she was thinking. If we think back to what she was doing during the debate with Carter, where she was sort of doing things in reverse, where rather than trying to just simply focus on fortifying Reagan and let come what may, she actually focused on how to sort of pull the rug out from under Carter, which is quite interesting. Can you see anything else there that's
The mutual exchange on the first chart of Mars to Moon.
Oh yeah. Yeah, good pickup.
It seems strange to have Mars combust and in fall on the 8th house and then move into the 8th house. I mean, you wouldn't really want that, would you, if someone's having surgery, given that Mars is an actual significant of surgery.
Yeah.
8th house of death, basically.
Mhm.
But you wouldn't think that she would choose that
There are things that really do, when you look at it closely, for anyone on the other end in Zoom land that couldn't hear it, Rita made the point that it's strange that Mars is on the 8th house cusp up here in the 13th of July chart, which I agree. There are some things that you would question.
But there is the Jupiter also aspecting the Mars, and Jupiter comes in the 9th house from the moon in the second chart. So that's a very benevolent thing.
Yeah.
Or supportive thing.
Yeah. So, and I mean, with these sorts of things as well, you'd sort of feel like a lot was out of your hands as well, I imagine, because he's already in hospital. He needs to have this operation. So as we know with electional charts, you can't always choose the most auspicious time. Sometimes you've got to work with what you've got. But it is interesting thinking about the way that she approached charts. She sort of definitely had a novel approach that is quite creative, I think, in the way that she's done some of this work.
Jupiter does matter because it's a rising sign on Earth.
Yeah, that's Reagan's rising sign. Yeah, I should.
I'd rather not have the moon in Aries. I'd rather have the moon in Gemini in the 6th
Yeah.
house if I had to go to any kind of surgery.
That's true. Yeah. General themes of haste are something that you could think about.
I mean, it's unusual that someone even has a choice for any medical matter. You often don't have any choice.
Yeah.
It's not the most suitable astrology, and then you have to try and work around how you can make it suitable.
Exactly. I imagine Reagan probably had a bit more pull there. Like, I'm not going before eggs and toast.
People are trying to find Caesareans, those in astrology,
Yeah.
but they couldn't play God.
Yeah, absolutely. So interesting. Like, I mean, again, as I say, in her material, she doesn't actually go in depth about this, but I was sort of tickled by it and was twirling my beard over it.
Everything you said about it's a completely different approach.
Very different.
40 odd years ago to what it might be today.
Yeah. And this was at the time too, in the 80s, when there was like a lot of the astrologers that are held up as big luminaries in astrology were around then too, sort of coming up through the ranks, like the Steve Forrests, the Demetra Georges. So she was certainly connected, and the modern more psychological approach to astrology was certainly around at the time. And there is a quote, I didn't put it into the slides, but because I thought I would let Joan off for this one. She doesn't speak very charitably about the modern approach. She doesn't say, she certainly has, if you read her other books, her books, like Astrology for Adults, for instance, you go through that, it sounds very cookbook when you go through it. Like it's dated a little bit in some of its observations. Some of it seems a bit silly, but there are certain things that, have a bit more depth when you sort of squeeze it out. But so she certainly did operate, like, I mean, she used the modern planets, which is something that at that time, most people, I imagine, were doing. But she didn't rule them out in charts. She never makes a comment as to whether or not she perceives herself as being traditional or modern in her approach to astrology. But when she was interviewed by a reporter for the Toronto Star, she said that a lot of modern astrologers think that prediction is bad. And her summation of that was that that's because they can't do it, is what she said. And she's been quoted as saying that in an old edition of the Toronto Star. So what is interesting, another thing that she made a comment about was that Reagan has natally his Jupiter here on the inside cusp is in Scorpio, and it's conjunct the South Node. And while she doesn't make this reference in the text, she doesn't bring the South Node up in her text. She says that Jupiter in Scorpio, what she said precisely was that Scorpio, when it has rulership, and she doesn't specify what kind of rulership, but when it has rulership or dispositorship, that it can create cancers. So she saw Jupiter in Sagittarius in Reagan's chart as creating Cancer, which is something that Don Regan says that she actually missed, that Joan Quigley missed, but that doesn't sort of make its way into Joan's work. Here we have another, a really important meeting. Sorry.
I was going to say it's a pity that Chiron's not shown there.
That's my fault. I never added in. And in Joan's source material, she doesn't actually cast the charts. She provides the dates and times, which sort of, you've got to jump a few hurdles to be looking at the charts she put forward. But yeah, it would be interesting in this case to see where it was.
And in that time, Chiron wouldn't have been used as profusely as
Yeah,
today.
Melanie Reinhardt was still growing up.
Still looking at what it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is the next big chart, is the Geneva Summit of 1985. So this is Mikhail Gorbachev. It was rolling off my tongue all day. The ascendant of this meeting must have hit something. So this was at a period where up until this point, I'm not well versed in this period of history. I was just about to enter the world a year after this. So I am late to the party. But at this period, tension between I believe still at that point it was the USSR and the US was still pretty fraught. So the idea of a meeting like this was actually quite significant in terms of international relation. And Reagan going over, actually you see him here wearing just a suit, and then you see Gorbachev here in an overcoat. And I'm a big fan of The West Wing. I don't know about anyone else, but I just watch it to death. And there's a scene in The West Wing that comes from this particular image where they sort of say, you know, don't lose the coat. You know, it looks more presidential to go without the coat. And it's from this moment that that's taken. One of his aides suggested that it actually, there's a text that says that Reagan was wearing not just an overcoat, but a big woolly scarf. So he was definitely prepared for the weather. But they said, you know, lose that because it looks a bit better and you'll look like you have more vitality. So he got out, and Gorbachev's probably thinking, look at this guy without his coat, you know, what's he trying to prove? But they got on quite well. They got on really well at this first meeting. So the Geneva Summit was about talking about as far as I understand it, winding back nuclear arms, talking about how to de-accelerate that process, possibly get rid of it. So given where things had come from before that, again, really significant meeting. And as Joan was tasked with this sort of electional material, here's Joan's chart for the Geneva Summit, 16 November 1985, 8:35 a.m. And she said, this was the time I chose for Air Force One to depart for Geneva. So once again, she's using the moment of departure as the beginning of the endeavor. She said, what I wanted most was for Gorbachev to be willing to listen to what Ronnie, and there it is again, all through her book, it's Ronnie all the time, which it just sort of hits the mental palate in a weird way. Given that they, you know, she wasn't calling him up, she was speaking to Nancy, but you know, she refers to him as Ronnie all the time throughout her book. What I wanted most for Gorbachev to be willing to listen to was to be willing to listen to what Ronnie had to say, and hopefully to be persuaded to come over to his way of thinking. I did this in a classic way, astrologically, by putting the planet that represented Ronnie's Russian counterpart in the first house of the chart, so that he would naturally be drawn to Ronnie. So as an electional chart, she's just put the seventh house ruler, being Mercury, into the first house cusp. Once again, we see a pretty strong connection to Reagan's chart here. We see Sagittarius on the ascendant, very close to his own ascendant. And even though his MC by Joan's rectified working, it's pretty far off, the MC is still in Libra, which she must have thought worked quite nicely. She doesn't go into detail in regards to just how much sort of leeway she was given with her electional material, but there is evidence in the source text that says that, of which is Joan's book. Like, so to get a really comprehensive overview, I wanted to go through and read Joan's book, as well as Nancy's book and and Don Regan's book. So I read most of all of them, but they're in one of the texts, they talk about the fact that a trip of this nature is actually quite a big affair. That you've got advanced teams going over, doing work months in advance, like, you know, getting everything ready, probably checking everything out, making sure it's safe. So the idea that Joan was in charge of the departure, even though it sort of seems simple on the surface to say that she was choosing when the plane should take off, she actually had a huge amount of sway in terms of when all these people were going to go to work. And so, you know, she must have had this on the cards for a while. But yeah, this is the approach that she took with the electional chart. Obviously, she brings both nativities in. She says the summit took place from the 19th to the 21st of November. And although it did not produce an accord on arms control or other major issues, it did help put US-Soviet relations back on a business-like basis and strip the confrontational at this first meeting. They hit it off pretty quickly. And the internet's unstable. this individual meeting, there were several meetings that took place before they came to any sort of agreement. But this was kind of the icebreaker. So Joan's involvement in this, it wouldn't necessarily, obviously in her material, she wants to take as much credit for this as possible. She credits herself throughout her text as having done things that contributed to reshaping Nancy's image. She says that when the Reagans first went into the White House, Nancy was sort of getting pilloried in the press a lot. And she said, oh, I can't understand why they don't like me. I just want everyone to love me. And Joan said, that's fine. You know, I can fix that for you. And she takes full credit for the fact that she fixed Nancy's image, but doesn't necessarily go into detail how she did that astrologically. So she places a lot of emphasis on the fact that she had something to do with this process that unfolded on account of the Geneva summit, which I dare say she probably did. I'd say it's not so much that, like with lead in our boots, as we know, it's not that Joan made something happen, but she sort of put the pieces in the right spot at the right time for what was already primed to happen. She speaks of the fact that there was a lot of synastry between Gorbachev and Reagan's charts. So this electional chart really was about making sure that they were primed for the best possible meeting, which it seems like she achieved here. They got on quite well. But as I say, they didn't necessarily, or as Joan says, that they didn't reach an accord at this meeting. This was really the first one, the icebreaker. The second one was the Reykjavik summit. Now, this is just kind of interesting to think about, like because she says in her text that according to Joan, her mother had passed away when she was asked to elect this chart. And she got up in the morning and she said, oh, the phone was ringing and, you know, the last person in the world I wanted to hear from was Nancy because my mother had just died. And Nancy says, Joan, get up. You know, I need you to go to work. And she's like, I can't do it today, Nancy. My mother just died yesterday. And she said, well, you're the third person in the world that's about to hear what I'm about to say. She said, I know it. The president knows it. And you're going to be the third person in America, not the world. That Gorbachev had reached out and asked whether or not they could have a secret meeting to be held in Reykjavik where they could continue their talks. And in amongst that, Nancy was sort of sniffing out if there was a way that this second discussion would be something that could be kept secret, or if it would be something that would eventually come out. And of that process, she said, and here's another interesting creative way she approached it. After casting up Ronnie's location chart for the proposed Reykjavik visit, I compared it with this chart for Washington during the same period. The Washington chart was mediocre to poor. The Reykjavik chart was stupendous. There was no question that Ronnie should go to Reykjavik for his second historic meeting with Gorbachev. Now, I'll break that down and say it a bit more slowly. She says that she cast up Ronnie's location chart for Reykjavik, which to me sounds as though she's relocated his nativity from Washington for Reykjavik, and then looked at transits probably to that chart at the time, or the elected chart that she was looking at. Which is interesting because she hasn't brought that up in regards to any of the other electional work that she's done. So when he's gone to take a step out of the country, she must have always been relocating his chart and looking at how that election was affecting him based off his relocated chart, which is a whole separate subject, but not what I think people would do in classic electional astrology, but it seemed to be working for her. And she said, you know, clearly it was a lot better if he were to go. Yeah, so the Reykjavik summit also was the second in, I think, a series of 3 summits that they had before they actually finally came to some agreement. This second one doesn't look quite as good. I mean, we can sort of see the fingerprints of similar astrological work at play. She's put the 7th house ruler over there in the 1st house. However, it's not in great shape in this chart. We have the 1st house ruler in the 3rd house, so arguably the house of discussions. But she's got the moon there in the 2nd house. So I'm not sure if she was given more of a heads up about this or not, but this was going well. Everyone was quite happy for it. Apparently, it received a lot of publication. The reason that she says that she knew it wasn't going to be secret was because all of Reagan's relocated planets moved up into the upper hemisphere of the chart. So she thought, no way, everyone's going to know about it, and they did. They were all over it. So the summit went really well up until the end, but then of course they needed a third. But getting back to the sort of ongoing saga here, Don Regan's revelation, obviously, as I said, was quite significant. You know, it caused waves, and everyone started to look at the Reagans like they must have lost the plot, right? And you know what, like they couldn't believe that this man that they loved so much had been doing something that must have seemed so cuckoo to the majority of people. Nancy does say at one point in her text that that she's quite shocked just how bad the press was about the revelation in Don Regan's book that this had found its way in to infect the White House. And I'm reminded of Sigmund Freud. I think it was Sigmund Freud's quote where he refers to the black tide of occultism having filtered into the White House. And she made a good point in her text, Nancy. She says at one point that that she found it to be hypocritical because all of these papers that were giving her really bad press all had horoscope columns in their paper. So they were running on the front page, you know, astrology in the White House. And then in the back, you're flipping through to the 12 zodiac signs. And it's interesting to think about. But when it came out and Nancy and Joan spoke about it, Nancy apparently got straight on the phone to Joan, who was abroad in Paris at the time, and said to her sister, this can never come out. You know, this can never go anywhere. And Joan's sister, you know, there's a limit to what she could do. When she finally got on to Nancy, she said that ultimately, no matter what, keep this under wraps. And she said, well, Joan actually disagreed. And she said, well, no, I'm a reputable astrologer. You know, if astrology at this time would have been receiving some bad press as well. You know, the invocation in the media would have been that it's cuckoo, you know, even if they didn't outright say it. So Joan said, well, no, I have to stand up and clear my name and also to stand up for astrology to a certain extent. So she told Nancy that she wasn't going to remain quiet, that she was going to go on the record about it. And she said to Nancy, but what should I do if sensitive information comes up? And Nancy says, as you can see here, lie if you have to lie, which Nancy never actually comments about, but I think it's pretty fair to assume that that's probably true. Nancy says here, well, I was never certain that Joan's astrological advice was helping to protect Ronnie. The fact is that nothing like March 30 ever happened again. March 30 was the date of his attempted assassination. Was astrology one of the reasons? I don't believe it really, she says, I don't really believe it was, but I don't really believe it wasn't. But I do know this, it didn't hurt, and I'm not sorry that I did it.
With Mike Wallace for 60 Minutes last night. Nancy Reagan said, as she said before, that she turned to California astrologer Joan Quigley after her husband was shot and wounded by John Hinckley, that she heard Quigley had forecasted. Mrs. Reagan flatly denied Quigley had any influence on U.S. policy, but she acknowledged that she did have influence on the timing of presidential events. But Quigley sees herself as much more of a mover and shaker in the Reagan presidency. Mike Wallace questioned closely Joan Quigley about what it was she did for Nancy Reagan.
She would call you and say, what's a good date for a news conference?
Oh, yes, every news conference, every speech, except there were a few exceptions when it was an emergency and it had to be done right then. But I did almost all the speeches, and then when Air Force One would take off with the president, I always did that.
What do you mean?
Well, the takeoffs and landings. You see, it would ensure this not just the safety, but the success of the trip. I mean, there were many times that I did that. And it's fabulous being able to work with Air Force One because you can say, you know, do this at 3 minutes after 6 and they'll do it.
You would call Mrs. Reagan.
No, she would call me. She would ask me, for instance, what are the best times for the president to do this or that? And I would say this time would be dangerous or the outcome would be bad at a certain time. And I would just really pick the times that they did things of great importance. Sometimes I didn't, but most of the time I did.
And how often would this go on?
Well, it varied. As necessity dictated, but toward the end, around 87 in the fall, when the Washington summit was so important and all of us were working so hard for it, then Nancy would call me, 2 or 3 times a day sometimes. And
ask you what?
Well, there was so much scheduling to be done for various things, and then it's very important when something like the INF treaty would be signed to do it at a very good time. And I was working terribly hard at that time. I did work.
Are you serious, Miss Quigley?
What do you mean, am I serious?
I mean, the wife of the President of the United States would call Joan Quigley and would talk to her for a couple of hours on the telephone.
Yes.
And would talk about what time a treaty should be signed, the INF treaty, for instance, or what time Air Force One should take off.
Yes, but I'm a very good technical astrologer, and I know how to schedule time. I also affected definitely the relationship between the superpowers because of my reading of Gorbachev's horoscope. The minute I read it, I knew that I had to change the evil empire attitude before they had their first summit. And I went about that. I talked to Nancy for 2 or 3 hours, convincing her that Gorbachev was the kind of man that was not only tough, but intelligent, open to new ideas, and that he had vision like Ronald Reagan did. And that these two men had a fantastic chemistry between them. And I went into that at very great length, and I also chose the time when Air Force One would depart from Geneva.
Do you still do any astrological work for Mrs. Reagan?
No, I haven't heard from Nancy since the news broke. And she didn't want me to meet the media. And I told her I wouldn't harm her in any way, but I just had to appear because I wanted to represent reputable astrologers properly.
And so you've had no contact with
Astrologer Joan Quigley in an interview with Mike Wallace. And that's part of This and Other Worlds tonight. Dan Rather for the CBS Evening News. See you tomorrow. Good night.
So she didn't do great. Sorry. Oh, that was online. Yeah. So yeah, I do think that, you know, she seemed like a bit of a deer in the headlights in that. I mean, I don't think she had a full appreciation of the fact that they were really out to skewer her, really, more so, or make a bit of a joke out of her, as opposed to hearing her side of the story. They certainly went in a very biased way, and she seemed very out of her depth in terms of being able to pull it back, the poor thing. Yeah. She did speak well, yeah. And she, you can tell by her material that she is quite a sophisticated astrologer. You know, no matter what you make of her approach, she's a highly technical astrologer, as she says. She has a very firm grip on the fundamentals and also the sophisticated precision that comes into something like electional work. But just summing up some of what we've looked at, because there's so much that you could talk about in terms of her charts. I think one of the things that we can say, as we sort of spoke about earlier, is that a focus of Joan's work is that she used natal astrology insofar as it connected with something that was beyond the individual. There was no point in any of her work where she was focused on the interior framework of what Ronald Reagan might have been feeling or what his mission in life was. It was very much about how he connected to the world beyond himself. What's interesting to me, though, is that she didn't actually really engage with much traditional mundane work. Now, when you would assume that somebody who's an astrologer is working for, you know, as they say, the leader of the free world, that they would be looking at something like ingress or lunation charts. And there was no reference in her material about an Aries ingress. There was no reference to lunations. And there's no overt sense that she was focusing on the affairs of state directly. It's not as the scope of her work really does seem to have been about the president first and foremost, and the way that he was engaging with the public. Policy decisions are something that virtually everyone agreed, all of those three parties being Nancy, Joan, and Don Regan. No one came out and said, oh, Nancy shaped this policy with astrology. That never came up. And because of that, Nancy was sort of somewhat naive in thinking it wasn't a big deal. You know, we're still running the country. We're just asking this person when a good time is to do things. And as I say, a little naive because people just took a much different view of it. But there was no overt sense that she was having a direct impact on affairs of state. And as I say, no traditional mundane material in what she was doing. Her mandate, as far as I can see, when you go through the material, when you look closely at the charts, even though there's an admission from both Nancy and Joan that her first priority was to protect the president, and Nancy never comes within a hair's breadth of saying that she did anything beyond that, the charts really speak for themselves. And I think the very fact that she was electing charts for the beginning of things like debates and the beginning of things like international summits certainly say that Joan had some mandate that was beyond simple protection for him. What that was, the full scope of it, is probably always going to remain under wraps, but it's something that's that you can sort of tease out when you look at the charts themselves. And the key thing here, this is something that I was shocked by when I read Joan's book, because when I first got my hands on it as a young astrologer, I thought, oh, this is fantastic. You know, I want to see what this person did. It sort of was pitched in a way that it gave you the inside scoop into her practice and the work that she did with Reagan. But it's quite surprising just how vague on technique that she is in the book. She doesn't say, this is how I did it. She doesn't go into technical detail about what was on the cusp of where or what was quintile to this or anything like that. She never comes anywhere close to that.
Yeah, in fact, that was very interesting, the previous Reykjavik chart, because she kind of, normally she's been choosing the Sag ascendant, but she chose the Scorpio because it is kind of secret. So I think she was probably understanding the nature of sign, the quality of time, and the quality of event, and trying to tie them up.
Absolutely, yeah. It is interesting, and like it would be nice if she went a little bit further in terms of giving us some background into her thinking. In thinking about why she didn't do that, I mean, obviously this book primarily was probably, you know, she's got a publisher, she's got people who are going over the things that she's putting in there, so it was probably beyond the scope of a publisher's interest to have technical astrological information in the book, which is fair. And that has to be said in order to be fair to Joan's recounting of this entire tale. But one thing that I did wonder was, you know, did she avoid being, was she vague on her technique to avoid criticism? And by that, I mean, astrologers are a hungry pack. If we go to our conferences and we go to talks and, you know, everyone's got a different take on a particular chart. And I did wonder whether or not, given the high profile nature of these charts, if she wanted to avoid any of the fanfare there and actually keep those techniques to herself. It's possible, but, you know, that's just a possibility. I did also wonder if there was an intuitive function at play, which is something that was unique to Joan, where we all look at a chart and go, aha, like, you know, look at that. And sometimes people will pick something out that you hadn't even seen before. Or you hadn't even considered before, that moment of connection that happens sometimes with charts. Perhaps that was a little bit at play in what Joan was doing too. In her material, she does make reference to how strong a team she and Nancy were. And she said that they would spend a lot of time on the phone for hours and that they would work together. And another piece that I wondered was whether or not Joan would talk at a high level about astrology and Nancy would provide this contextual background that could perhaps fill in the detail. Again, just another possibility. It's something that could feed into why she was vague on technique. I think by looking at the charts closely, you do tease out a lot of what her approach is, but it would be it's interesting because in the opening passages of the book, Joan says that she dedicates this book to astrology. And then when you flip through the pages, there's not really anything in there that astrologers can take away. So you really do have to sort of wonder, who was this book really for? But there are points in her text where some of the ethics that she engages in are kind of questionable. And ethics are a sort of a hot button subject, I guess, for people in the astrology community. And I wouldn't go so far as to say that Joan necessarily did the wrong thing. I mean, she's a working astrologer of a particular ilk, you know, she's from a particular background, and the opportunity comes by her desk to do work for the president. I don't blame her for being excited about it. I can totally understand why she was. And I think that if we're all practicing astrologers were to consider her position, I think everyone would be sort of excited about the possibility of doing that. But where she does make reference to things like, oh, I called Nancy up and said, did you want this report? Or Nancy calls and says, could you have protected him? Obviously, we only get a certain portion of the anecdote, but you do have to wonder whether or not she was sort of twisting Nancy's arm a little bit, or accentuating the utility of her role. Not sure with that. And again, everyone will have a different opinion. But also, it's also quite interesting to put on the table. If we go back to that Carter-Reagan debate, where if you think about the nature of what's fated and what's free will, the idea that an astrologer is going to come in, and as we saw in the example, she was accentuating the pitfalls for Carter. So in the hopes that he would slip up and get egg on his face, which is what ended up happening. It's difficult to talk about that without having a parallel version of events that tells us what would have happened if Joan were not in the picture, which is always sort of the bugbear with electional astrology. But it's interesting thinking about the ethical nature of that. If it can be done, why not do it? And if somebody can look out for their best interests by making sure that someone else is perhaps in a more precarious situation, what does that say about the ethical nature of the approach? Not something certainly I'm going to hazard towards coming to, but I put it up there for thoughts for people to think about in terms of that particular application of astrology. I think it's too easy to simply say that it's wrong because it's clearly quite influential and effective. But it's interesting to think about the way that Joan approached these things. So that's it.
That's his chart compared to John's chart.
Yeah. That's also something that's quite fascinating as well. And they've got some synastry there also. From memory, I believe it's like a Neptunian thing. I didn't include it in here just because I felt like it would take us off a little bit too far. But she's
That day,
yeah,
the cost would be phenomenal.
interesting.
Astrologer
Yeah.
would have to charge a lot of money.
So it's interesting. I didn't put it into the slides, but Joan goes on quite a lot about money throughout the process of her book. And there's an astrologer who I won't name, but I spoke to as I was preparing this material. And I said, is there anything that you know about Joan that other people perhaps don't know that's not on the public record? And she met Joan, and she said that one of Joan's first words were that, she didn't get paid appropriately. And apparently Joan, even though she got paid, at one point, because she tasked herself, she saw herself as tasked with improving Joan's image, improving Nancy's image. She drew the parallel that advertising agencies had done similar work for other people and had been paid in the millions. And she says that the comment to the astrologer that I know but won't name was that I barely got paid anything. And I doubt that too. Given the fact that that Joan, she sort of says in those other sections, she makes reference to the fact that she only does astrology for the people that she wants to. He's like a producer at the Merv Griffin show saying, "Do my horoscope for my families," and she says no. Like, no, I don't think so. So I'm pretty sure she was very likely probably out for a serious commission with this sort of work. And there is evidence to suggest that she was getting paid monthly.
But paid very well. But relative to advertising agencies, probably not.
Absolutely.
But she would have got paid very well.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that whatsoever.
I think the sliding scale is in Joan's mind. I think it's definitely relative. I think that she sees the work as that she's doing quite significant, and it was significant enough for them to engage her. But
it's involved in politics, and her favour is
that
side of politics, she would probably be negotiable on money.
Absolutely. And then there's also the idea too that she, one thing that never comes up, and again, I think it's due to Nancy's naivete, is that there's never a question about paying Joan for her silence. Like, that doesn't seem to be a component in this at all. And that sort of tongue-in-cheek photo I included of Nancy at the beginning, that like, what? Like, she was absolutely mortified when Don Regan came out with his memoir. I don't think that she could believe it, to be honest. I think she was gobsmacked that someone would be so open.
I'm pretty sure I read Ronald Reagan talking about this.
Yeah.
Basically saying, I haven't found anything really wrong with it.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I wonder if she predicted her own death because she went out third, second return.
Yeah. I wish that we did have more that was on the record about her. Because as far as I know, she was still going to conferences. She still went out astrologically But I don't know much about the scope of her work beyond the Reagans. I don't know if she's ever taught anyone more specifically the techniques. Certainly no one's ever come out about it. But she feels it was at a high level. But I thought she's quite no matter what people think of her or her techniques, no matter how we feel about her ethical approach or even the work that she did and how she did it, I think she's quite an important figure for contemporary astrology. Just in terms of the chapter that she came in on the scope of what she was doing, I think it's important to keep her work in the consciousness.
She's a huge contrast to Jim Dixon, who predicted, tried to predict that Kennedy, tried to prevent the assassination on numerous occasions. She approached Kennedy, JF Kennedy, to prevent that, specifically for that day and location.
Yeah.
But as you say, she was not totally astrologically. She was coming from a very mixed background.
Yeah.
And she was completely ignored,
Yeah.
you know, for the Kennedy situation.
Yeah.
After he died, she basically said, like, you know, oh, he's dead now, without knowing, without hearing anything.
Right.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, she did, yeah.
I just want to ask, you didn't come across anything that indicated where astrologers from that era got their knowledge from? Was she self-taught?
Oh, that's a good point, actually. Yeah. So according to Joan, she's very vague about it in her material, like a lot that's in there. She sort of washes over it. She says that, but from what I've been able to piece together, her mother was quite interested in astrology and used to buy a lot of astrology books and have them in the house. So Joan was familiar with it. From what I understand, she didn't start studying astrology seriously until after she went to university. And then she sort of dove right into it, and she committed herself to study with someone that I believe she refers to as sort of like an Eastern mystic type figure. And that's all she says about it. She doesn't say who she learnt with, but she did have a teacher before she started practicing. But she doesn't go beyond that. She doesn't sort of.
What year was she born?
Just there, 1927.
So it's nothing to indicate either type of astrology she was practicing.
She doesn't detail that. And she's quite specific about it. In her work, I believe that she does include like her other printed work, like Astrology for Adults, for instance. I believe that she's got Neptune in there from memory. Like she writes that up in a sort of cookbook type fashion. But yeah, the lid's on pretty tight with that. She definitely didn't want it to get out.
So she doesn't refer to things like essential dignity or stability. Or
no.
I think back in 1967, when she was 40, I'm guessing, I might be wrong with her, astrology was less differentiated to what it is today.
Yeah.
Because I have a similar sort of background. I didn't do astrology till I was in my middle 40s. But because I'm born in India, we were being handed astrology books. I mean, I've got a book that's 100 years old from India.
Right.
Which is basic astrology, and it's tropical astrology, not Vedic.
Right.
So, you know, like, I know that sort of general background, and reading all those magazines that came out, you know, in that 60s period, you know, the dark half period, there was a whole lot of magazines out there.
Yeah.
You should buy every week, you know, you go out to the news station, buy them every week. I think it was less differentiated to what it is today.
Yeah, possibly, yeah. I know that around the time she was with the Reagans, there was sort of that rise of the spiritual movement in astrology, which she seems to have not necessarily distanced herself from, but she certainly places a distinction on it, at least to the Toronto Star. Sorry?
Do you have a chart?
Oh, I can have a quick look and see if I have it. I'm pretty sure I do. Let's bring it up.
At her time, did she have any struggle with any of those political analysts and all trying to shut her down?
Not that I'm aware. No, I think that was all a bit after, a bit before her. Oh, actually, it wouldn't have necessarily been before her time, but I don't think that she never references it. No. Has that come up on the screen? Yeah. Let me just put that there. So, so an Aries sun, it's interesting in William Lilly's work, the planet Mars, when you read his definition of it, he says that people who are represented by Mars, he means this in a horary context. He says that they're large reporters of their own acts. And it's interesting that she's got the sun in Aries there, where, you know, she's okay with putting herself right out there. You know, here's what I did. Here's the work I did. Even in that little televised interview, she's, you know, I did all the takeoffs and all this sort of stuff.
I can't see that. I don't know if you can read share.
Oh,
that screen. Then we're still seeing the same one. Yeah.
Not only does she have the sun in Aries, Mars is the most angular,
And not in the 10th house, which is futuristic.
most elevated.
And the sun's exactly trying Reagan's ascendant.
yeah. Yeah, she was she definitely spoke quite highly of him. And again, all those references to Ronnie. At one point she says she wrote him a letter and she addressed it as Ronnie, and when he wrote back, he wrote Joan, and that was a big deal for her. But yeah, interesting chart. At one point, I didn't put it in the slides, but there is a point when she talks about a particular chart and makes reference to the 8th house as being the house that rules astrology. And she goes off on what sort of would seem like a bit of a lark, where she sort of says, oh, and then Jupiter's up on the 10th house, and that's why astrology is like his astrologer is going to be doing such influential things for him. And I think from memory, was one of the things that contributed to all of that coming out. So I'm not sure where the correlation of the 8th house comes from with astrology. I'm not sure if, like, you know, a more modern interpretation, would be the occult. Yeah.
The sun kind of exposing it, and then the Pluto on the 10th house.
Yeah.
I wonder if that film Reagan with Dennis Quaid mentioned.
I saw an image of that today too. Doesn't he look like a spitting image? Like, I thought, my God. Yeah, yeah, wouldn't that be good? But if I can quickly put up
Saying that she said that generally the 8th house rules astrology. Is that what she was saying?
she said that the 8th house ruled astrology, and she was looking at the planetary ruler to give insight into that. And this is her synastry with Nancy.
Mars, Pluto, Scorpio, 8th house is kind of.
Yeah, I'd say it's probably the occult reference, which is a hint that she's taking in some modern insights as well, in order to say that. Yeah. And here, this is her synastry with Nancy. And there's that Moon Neptune conjunction that sits, well, technically, Joan's moon highlights Nancy's Neptune. So it's as though her friendship, which she referred to it as, her friendship with Nancy, Nancy's friendship with Joan is something that triggered that Neptunian experience for Nancy. And interesting that Nancy's Saturn sits right there on Joan's ascendant. Quite a dynamic sort of synastry set between those two. Especially with Pluto being, it's sort of wide, but, like, you know, it's hovering up there in the 10th. But interesting to see. But yes, fascinating. No, that's the lot from me. So I hope everyone enjoyed that.
Right.
Please.
Are we still, if anyone's interested?